problematic, troubling, offensive cinema exists. Faced with deserved condemnation for their white supremacist fascistic expressions, in other circumstances films like this would be ignored, left to fall into obscurity. However, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation and Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will are frequently cited as foundational cinematic works by filmmakers, film historians, and scholars alike. These challenging films become more difficult to avoid when their technical influences have informed the basis of an artistic medium, casting a disconcerting shadow that remains inescapable. So how exactly do we approach troubling classics, if we should even approach them at all? Widely considered as the most racist film of all time, understandably, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation is an off-putting, daunting creation. An epic romance set during and after the American Civil War, Griffith's film unravels a relationship between a Unionist daughter and a Confederate colonel, which blooms at the time of the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. A film that boasts of authentic recreations of historic American events, such as the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The elephant in the room for Griffith's film is the inclusion of the violent hate of the Ku Klux Klan, portrayed as heroic and noble. The sheer mention of this is bound to make most viewers' skin crawl, yet the film received immense success at the time of its release. Tom Brook for the BBC, partially in conversation with Professor Alan Rice, both elaborate on the film's scale, in spectacle and success, stating that The Birth of a Nation was the creation of D.W. Griffith, who had tried his hand as an actor and playwright, but whose real genius lay in filmmaking. Nothing on its scale had ever been attempted before. It was the epic story of the relationship between two American families, one Union, the other Confederate, at the time of the Civil War and the Reconstruction that followed. The film ran for more than 3 hours and employed, according to a New York Times report from the time, 18,000 people and 3,000 horses. By 1922 it had been watched by more than 5 million people. It was the first blockbuster. It was a box office success, a mainstream film, so utterly mainstream, says Professor Alan Rice, a Birth of a Nation expert at the Institute for Black Atlantic Research at the University of Central Lancashire, who has been organising a series of symposia on the film. It made history by becoming the first film ever to be screened at the White House, but it was revolutionary for another reason. It was very important in that it was the first full-scale long narrative using a lot of the new techniques of filmmaking, says Rice. The success of the film at the time of its theatrical release could earn The Birth of a Nation the recognition as cinema's first blockbuster. The scale of the film's spectacle during its war sequences is impressive to this day. Thousands of extras, plumes of smoke, horses and carriages racing away as soldiers charge and fire as far as the eye can see. War scenes such as this are a key source of inspiration for generations of filmmakers that followed. Akira Kurosawa's own wartime scenes in Ran or Seven Samurai, George Lucas's grand battles within Star Wars, armies upon armies in Braveheart. Furthermore, The Birth of a Nation developed a multi-storyline narrative structure at a time when cinematic storytelling wasn't commonplace. While the narrative of this film is simplistic and dull by today's standards, it's difficult to connect with a romance where the characterization is thin and steeped in layers of racism. D.W. Griffith developed a foundation of how films, especially epics, would tell multiple storylines for the following century. When Professor Alan Rice describes this film as important due to utilising new filmmaking techniques, this is exactly what he means, and is the significant aspect of this film that has continued to inspire filmmakers to this day. However, beyond the film's technical prowess, the sheer racism within the film cannot and should not be ignored. What feels most alienating and disturbing within The Birth of a Nation is how D.W. Griffith depicts racist atrocities as if they were acts of heroism to be admired. A man enters a saloon full of black men and proceeds to assault them, forcing them out of the bar. The Ku Klux Klan terrorize a black man deemed as a barn burner. The Confederacy charges into a town to obliterate black soldiers, where black survivors are encouraged to be thankful while cleaning up the aftermath. Black characters are often performed by white actors in blackface, portraying black Americans with horrific racist stereotypes based within sweeping assumptions reinforcing the hate-filled bias of white supremacy that unfortunately persists today. These stereotyping images are bound to make audiences uncomfortable. Beyond the film's technical prowess, its racism has persevered throughout the century, as The Birth of a Nation has been used as a Ku Klux Klan recruitment film, and many of its racist stereotypes continue to be upheld today in all their ugliness, reaffirming white supremacist views against interracial romance and desegregation. If at any point we naively believe that racism has ever been solved, due to segregation becoming abolished due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then it is white privilege that shields many of us within the audience, unaffected by the damages that these present-day white supremacist attitudes commit. Professor Alan Rice, within Tom Brooks' article on the film for the BBC, proposes a powerful notion necessary to countering and dismantling the racist attitudes that persevere, that have been illuminated by D.W. Griffith's film. When it is shown, it should be shown within the context of a debate. Censoring it would make it more underground. It would play into the hands of the racists, who would say we can't debate with the film. I think the legacy really is that we don't lie down in front of these images, that we create works of art that speak back to those images and create new realities. To erase the presence of The Birth of a Nation is to push it towards the racist fringes that feel empowered by the film's ignorance. In our attempt to dismantle the emboldening of white supremacy, it's worth acknowledging D.W. Griffith's troubling classic, being able to recognise and separate its cinematic merit from its outright hatred. This film may use blockbuster scale and filmmaking structure for hatred, but filmmakers that follow do not need to do the same thing when utilising these tools. Additionally, Professor Rice suggests the creation of new art, new imagery that counteracts the racism that's in this film. This is a key step to dismantling white supremacy in the arts, nurturing, supporting, and embracing black artistry that presents an often underrepresented perspective on a myriad of inspirations. Professor Rice specifically highlights DJ Spooky's Rebirth of a Nation, a documentary and hip-hop performance that re-edits D.W. Griffith's film with a perspective of reclamation, offering visual commentary examining America's colonialist past. We cannot ignore the racist past of colonialism, nor the way that white authorities attempted to undermine and romanticize its atrocities, but what we can do is recognize, acknowledge, and support the creation of new cinematic art that aims to craft with and reclaim the filmmaking language for the nurturing of emerging artistic voices. Another example of a difficult classic to approach, and yet one with an undeniably, uncomfortably influential legacy across generations of filmmakers, as well as generations of prejudice, is Leni Riefenstahl's infamous Nazi propaganda film, Triumph of the Will. Portraying a 1934 Nuremberg rally led with speeches by Adolf Hitler, Riefenstahl's film presents jubilant soldiers at play, militant spectacles and traditionalist rural Germany infused with Nazi iconography. The outright scale of fascist uniformity within Triumph of the Will is presented with a technical filmmaking efficiency and ambition that is where the core of Riefenstahl's cinematic influence blooms. Without Triumph of the Will, scenes such as Scar singing Be Prepared to a procession of marching hyena conformity in The Lion King, or the nightmarish uniform organisation of the Uruk-hai in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings would simply not look the same. Fascist aesthetics serve as an inspiration, but not as an endorsement. Triumph of the Will is influential on a level of filmmaking craft, but ideologically the film serves nothing unless if the viewer is already sympathetic towards fascism. Roger Ebert summarises this concisely within his review of Triumph of the Will, stating that it is one of the most historically important documentaries ever made, yes, but one of the best? It is a terrible film, paralysingly dull, simple-minded, overlong, and not even manipulative, because it is too clumsy to manipulate anyone but a true believer. It is not a great movie in the sense that the other films in this group are great, but it is great in the reputation it has and the shadow it casts. So if Triumph of the Will is so dull, and it honestly is because it becomes painful to endure so many repetitive speeches about the dangers of foreigners or free press, as many have come to realise about Donald Trump's own fascistic rallies, what has made this film specifically so influential across decades of filmmaking? Leni Riefenstahl's film implements sheer cinematographic ambition akin to Dziga Vertov's legendary Man with a Movie Camera, demonstrating a creative practicality rarely explored on this scale. Aerial shots, mounted shots taken from vehicles, shots down canals, wide shots into close-ups demonstrating both the immense scale and the visual details of each Nazi attending the rally, popularising fascistic aesthetics with such clarity that still makes Triumph of the Will a central reference point for those attempting to recreate similar imagery amongst their own story's portrayal of evil. If the film's emphasised angular presentation, hypersymmetry, and frequent shadows makes the viewer think of Fritz Lang's Metropolis or Sergei Eisenstein's Battle Potemkin, this isn't by coincidence. Riefenstahl's directorial intent was to use recognisable cinematic visual styles, removing them from their socialist backgrounds for the benefit of fascistic appropriation. It's in Triumph of the Will's visual engineering that solely keeps the film within creative inspiration, because the film itself, as a documentary, is a terrible one. A one-sided depiction of romanticised fascism, with no depiction of logistical reality or the consequences of such large-scale hatred. Triumph of the Will as a propaganda piece only serves to reaffirm Nazism. Roger Ebert, later in his review, elaborates on the film's superficiality, stating that Riefenstahl's camera is oblivious to one of the most fascinating aspects of the Nuremberg rally, which is how it was organised. Yes, there are overhead shots of vast fields of tents, laid out with mathematical precision, but how did the thousands eat, relieve themselves, prepare their uniforms and weapons, and mass up to begin their march through town? We see overhead shots of tens of thousands of Nazis in rigid formation, not a single figure missing, not a single person walking to the sidelines. How long did they have to stand before their moment in the sun? Where did they go and what did they do after marching past Hitler? In a sense, Riefenstahl has told the least interesting part of the story. Triumph of the Will is adamant on only cultivating the most visually extraordinary to the simple-minded fascist sympathisers who lack curiosity beyond surface-level presentation. While the film is ambitious in the sense of practical filmmaking, there is no ambition in offering narrative beyond the scale of fascism. This is why there is nothing much of merit to Triumph of the Will beyond cinematic influence. The film is ideologically ugly, often dystopic in the depiction of the wide reach of fascism, and the implications of this romanticism are terrifying when, even in the present day, neo-Nazis find poster boy inspiration in the film's depiction of traditionally chiselled soldiers and intimidating chants. Without self-awareness, fascists today are enamoured by the iconography and presentation within this film, which is likely why generations of filmmakers afterwards are so adamant on presenting this Nazi imagery as a force of evil. The depth of fascistic romanticism was genuine in Triumph of the Will, because, despite Leni Riefenstahl's claims that she was solely an artist commissioned by the Nazis, it remains a film created by a perspective supportive of its ideology. Eliza Rapoli wrote for The Guardian highlighting key evidence found during a posthumous investigation into Riefenstahl's Nazi sympathies, stating that it appeared Riefenstahl, a consummate editor, had perfected her posthumous presentation. Then slowly, fissures began to appear among the folders and files. There was a scribbled note in a calendar to vote NPD, a reference to the post-war neo-Nazi party. Recordings of private telephone conversations conveyed shared nostalgia for the decency and virtue of the Nazi years. There was a missing section of a 1934 interview Riefenstahl gave to the Daily Express which, when located in the newspaper's own archives, described the tremendous impression made on her by Mein Kampf, the first page of which had made her a confirmed National Socialist. Despite spending 4 years in a detention camp for Nazi sympathisers, Leni Riefenstahl's post-war Nazi sympathies hadn't subsided, illustrating that the propaganda films she directed for the Nazi Party were crafted with genuine fascistic alignment, reaffirming the disconcerting nature of Triumph of the Will, a dystopic vision of Nazi prosperity, an illusion conveniently ignoring the xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and genocide that serves as the Nazi backbone. Ultimately a film of evil, if filmmakers are seeking visual inspiration in how to depict wide-scale conformity and dictatorship, Triumph of the Will serves as a chilling point of reference. In conclusion, both of these films, The Birth of a Nation and Triumph of the Will, are bitter experiences to witness, often dull and ideologically outdated, promoting white supremacist and Nazi sympathies that rely on prejudiced stereotypes that reaffirms biased ignorance. These films are also undeniably influential on the current landscape of cinema, establishing filmmaking techniques and aesthetic decisions that would later be perfected by the generations of filmmakers that arose decades afterwards. The troubling nature of these films, when viewed with a present-day perspective on their influences and damages on the world, demands that we acknowledge the nature of controversial art, a product of their time and historical context when these ideologies were more commonplace, yet also a reaffirmation of currently persevering prejudices. While many people may understandably refuse to watch these films, it is worth acknowledging that, in their influence across subsequent generations of filmmakers, many artists have reclaimed the practical filmmaking techniques and aesthetic artistry present in these films, removing their hatred and bile to be appropriated for more modern and progressive filmmaking. Within The Lion King, there is no trace of anti-Semitism. Within Star Wars, there may be stormtroopers, the naming isn't coincidental, but they are far removed from the Klan and the Nazis in terms of appearance, never to be portrayed as heroic, but as the oppressors, similar to what Professor Alan Rice suggested in discussing The Birth of a Nation. The most productive approach to dismantling the hatred presented in these films is through the creation of new imagery and new ideas, appropriating the established techniques of these works as the basis for a greater source of progressive cinematic liberation. A special thank you to my incredible tier patron supporter Gil and Jared Spears of Concessions, as well as my super tier patron supporter Sportzilla.